Hello everyone, Red here. Now, I usually don't talk like this until the end of my videos, but considering that this is one of my most experimental videos, I'm just shaking things up, it seems. I just want to say from the start of this is not a lore drop. This is my own story and a different type of video. You'll see it's a short story taking place in the setting of Trench Crusade, and it's completely different to anything I've ever done before. I even brought in friends and even my girlfriend to voice act. But I don't think her part's in this video, actually. Doesn't matter. I have tried a whole different animation style. I've really done something that I've never tried before. This has been a brand new experience to me, and I'd just like to say before the video starts, if you enjoy this type of video, please like, subscribe, and please share the video. That is what YouTube recognizes the most in its algorithm, and is the best way to spread my channel. That's all for now. Welcome to the story of the battle for the Ashen Trench. The Ashen Trench was quiet, in the way only a battlefield can be before its destruction. A silence that was not peace, but anticipation. Every man stationed in Sector 4 knew it well. That hollow stillness in the moment before hell arrived. The air itself seemed heavier, laden with the mingled scents of oil, gunmetal, and the stagnant damp that rose from the churned earth. The soil here had been turned and returned by years of shelling, an endless cycle of digging, collapsing, and digging again, until it no longer resembled the farmland it had once been. Sector 4 was more than a position on a map. It was a living thing in the minds of its defenders. They knew its every curve and fold, the zigzagging forward trenches that reached towards the no man's land, the listening posts buried like spider holes ahead of the main line, the communication trenches that wormed back to the pillboxes and firing nests, the elevated rise crowned by the artillery battery, and the imposing silhouette of the citadel in the far rear, a bastion from which orders and reinforcements flowed. No dawn broke over the battlefield, at least not in any ordinary sense. The sun remained hidden behind a ceiling of ashen cloud, and the first light that reached the trenches was not golden, but a pallid grey. Yet the soldiers knew the day had begun when the faint tremor came underfoot. The deep, rhythmic growl of distant engines, Hell's war machines, were on the move. Scouts had whispered the warning in the night. From the blackened skeletons of dead forest to the shattered ridgelines, they had seen movement, shapes without clean edges, shifting in ways that seemed unnatural to the eye, flowing like a living tide across the cratered earth. The faithful did not sleep that night. They waited. The wind had shifted by dawn. It carried the heavy stink of smoke drifting in ragged curls over Trenchline Gabriel. The great guns of the battery, dug in behind the trenches and shielded by an apron of sandbags and corrugated steel, sat silent for now, their crews hunched in oilskin coats, waiting for orders to open fire. They were the heart of Sector 4's defense. 3 batteries of blessed 155mm pieces, consecrated by shrine anchorites months earlier, their barrels etched with scripture and marked with the seal of New Antioch's high command. Captain Lucian Marlowe of the Faithful's 3rd Yeoman Company leaned over the lip of the observation point, his binoculars fixed on a jagged rise in no man's land, known as Dead Man's Ridge. Beyond it, a pall of unnatural fog crawled low across the churned earth. In the half-light, the frog seemed to writhe against the ground like a living thing. His signaller muttered a quick prayer.
Report from the listening post?
Marlowe asked.
Nothing received since 0340 hours, sir.
The signaller replied, eyes flicking to the small brass receiver on the table. The wires that ran from it disappeared into the frozen mud toward the front.
Cut them?
Marlowe said grimly.
They've taken it.
At precisely 0400 hours, the first shell screamed overhead. It landed not as a thunderclap, but as a sudden, bone-snapping violent barrage. The ground leapt, flinging mud, stone, and splinters of wood skyward. The soldiers of the Ashen Trench ducked instinctively, pressing against their firing steps and dugouts. The second shell followed seconds later. Then came the curtain fire, a relentless, methodical bombardment that swept the trench line from one end to the other. The enemy's artillery was not indiscriminate. The central rise was struck with particular fury. Hell's commanders knew what the defenders already understood. As long as those guns roared, the advance would pay dearly in blood. The battery crews worked under a storm of incoming fire, their oilskin coats slick with rain and sweat, their steel helms ringing with the concussion of near misses. Yet they stood to their pieces, the recoil of each shot shaking the ground like an angry heartbeat. In the forward trenches, Commander Alaric von Tessen moved like a man born to this hell. Tall, broad-shouldered, and bearing the scar of a blade across his left cheek, he moved from section to section, boots splashing through the rising muck. He barked orders in a voice that cut through the din.
Keep your heads down, rifles ready, bayonets fixed. You fire when the barrage lifts, not before.
Signal runners darted past him, clutching message slips and map sketches in gloved hands, diving into the narrow communication trenches that led towards the citadel. One messenger, mud up to his waist, shouted as he passed,
Enemy massing in Delta 5, through Echo 7. Battery under sustained fire. Possible flank from the west.
The ground shook without pause, and the air was a choking soup of smoke and pulverized earth. The defenders' machine gun teams huddled in their dugouts, keeping their belts dry until they could man their weapons. Mortar crews, protected behind their earthen revetments, made quick adjustments to their angles and range, gambling on where the first wave of the enemy would reveal itself. At 0427, the pattern changed. The shells began to land deeper to the trench system, leaving the forward parapets momentarily untouched. Von Tessen's gaze sharpened. It was the classic preparation fire for an infantry assault. Drive the defenders underground, then send in the killers.
They are coming.
And as if summoned by his words, they emerged. Hellish legionnaires in rusted plate, their helms twisted into grotesque parodies of knightly visors, advanced in measured ranks. They carried black banners embroidered with symbols no priest of the faith dared name. Their boots splashed through the stagnant shell holes that scarred no man's land. The yeoman marksmen in the forward trench, veterans of the winter campaign at St. Arnaud's Bastion, raised their long-barreled rifles. At von Tessen's signal, a line of flame burst from the parapet, the report of their weapons rolling down the trench like drumfire, causing legionnaires to topple in the mud. But the rest did not falter. Behind them came the anointed, towering brutes in scorched armour, wielding heavy weapons and flamethrowers that glimmered with unholy light.
Target the standard bearers first,
Von Tessen ordered.
Drop the damn colours before they reach the wire.
The faithful's forward line answered with a storm of fire. Rifles cracked in disciplined volleys. Machine guns stuttered into life, the steady chattering rhythm cutting swaths through the oncoming figures. Mortars sent their bombs in high arcs, each detonation a brutal punctuation in the enemy's advance. The cries of men and beasts mingled, rising into a single inhuman chorus. The artillery battery, code-named St. Varric's Fist, had been firing in rotation for days, slowing the hellish advance across the different sectors. Without it, the Faithful's hold on Sector 4 would crumble in hours. The guns would only fire safely if the forward trench line held. If the enemy overran Gabriel, they would have a direct line of advance to the battery's flank. The battery bellowed again. Their shells slammed into the densest formation, hurling bodies skywards in showers of gore and soil. The blast tore craters into the landscape, but the enemy kept coming, climbing over their own dead, flowing around the craters, feeding the advance with fresh ranks. By 0435, the wire was under assault. Hellish wretches detonated charges that ripped open jagged gaps, and through these breaches came the shock troops, hulking forms with cleavers and hooked spears, bearing shotguns and pistols, their mouths working as they chanted in some foul tongue. In the center sector, a platoon of grenadiers met them head-on, hurling charges into the first wave, reducing the attackers to ruin. But in doing so, they drew more fire, and the enemy pressed harder at that point. Marlowe's eyes tracked eastward. The enemy was committing heavily toward the artillery battery, sending forward beasts of siege, unlike anything seen in this sector before. Massive artillery pieces, bound in plates of iron, their throats glowing with sickly lights from hell. They spat jets of green flame that clung to whatever they touched, burning through wet mud and stone alike. The front lines fought on. Every minute brought the enemy closer. The captain signalled for the first fallback markers to be prepared. If the line broke, and it would eventually, the Faithful would withdraw to the secondary trench line before the pillboxes, where their reserves and heavier weapons waited. The guns would be held for as long as humanly possible, but Von Tessen and Marlowe knew the truth. The enemy wanted them, and they would take every yard of Sector 4 in blood to get them. To the west, the shock troopers of Lieutenant Fenric Hall's platoon crouched in their dugout, shotguns and trench clubs close at hand. Their job was not to fire from afar. They were the counter-attacking hammer, meant to surge up the communication trenches and smash any breach before it widened.
Hold until they're inside the wire.
Hale muttered to his men.
We hit them when they think they've taken it.
The first breach came sooner than expected. At 0452, a section of southern wire line simply collapsed, not from artillery fire, but from wretched crawling over it, their pallid, malformed bodies slithering through the gaps like worms. The yeomen in that sector poured fire into them, but the creatures were too fast, darting between shell craters before hurling themselves into the trenches. The fight turned hand to hand instantly. One yeoman was dragged screaming over the parapet, another drove his bayonet through a wretch's throat, only to be bowled over by a second. Hale's shock troopers came up then, the dugout shaking as they vaulted the ladders, shotguns roaring. The sound was deafening in the confined trench, each blast reducing the wretched to sprays of ichor.
Plug the gap!
Hale shouted.
Plug the gap! Wire team, forward!
Two faithful engineers scrambled up with new coils of blessed wire, hammering stakes into the mud even as bullets from advancing legionnaires snapped past their heads. By 0505 hours, the hellish push had shifted. Two companies of legionnaires now angled towards the saps, the narrow forward extensions that jutted into no man's land on the eastern side, that offered enfielding fire across the ridge. Marlowe read it instantly. They were trying to bypass Gabriel's strongest sector and cut into the flank.
Mechanized infantry to the eastern saps,
he ordered into the field telephone. The reply crackled through. Affirmative. Within minutes, the grinding roar of an armoured tractor came from the reserve trench, hauling a squad of mechanized infantry forward. Their heavy plate armour gleamed dully into the trench lamps, each man bristling with short-barreled carbines and machine guns, as well as fragmentation grenades and holy relics. The mechanized infantry hit the eastern saps like a steel wall. Legionaries that tried to push into the narrow trench found themselves funneled into a killing ground. Grenades bounced off the walls, carbines spat in short, brutal bursts, and bayonets punctured through gaps in the enemy's armour. But every man in the faithful ranks knew the push was far from over. At 05:20 hours, the artillery witches made their presence known. From beyond Dead Man's Ridge, great tongues of green fire arced through the fog, falling among the battery guns. One shell struck the westernmost piece, flipping it from its emplacement and scattering its crew like ragdolls. Another detonated in the ammunition pit, the blast sending a plume of earth and fire 100 feet high. Marlowe's throat went dry.
Battery dispersed, keep the remaining guns firing.
Shrine anchorite, Sister Cassian, who had been blessing the guns between volleys, stood unmoved by the bombardment, her voice rising in a chant older than the First Crusade. The crews fought through the shrapnel and the witchfire, manhandling shells into the breach and keeping the surviving guns barking in defiance. But the hellish tide was rising. By 05:40 hours, Legionnaires had forced a wedge into Gabriel's centre sector, driving the faithful back 20 yards. Hale's shock troops countercharged twice, regaining some ground, but the anointed were in the trenches now, each swing of their cleavers shearing through men and timber alike. Marlowe sent word for the newer yeomen to advance from reserve. They poured into the gap with cries to the Almighty. They fought like men already promised a place in heaven, hurling themselves against the anointed with no thought for survival. The trench floor became a charnel house, mud, blood, and broken bodies underfoot. The battery's fire slackened. The crews were too busy fighting off the wretched that had slipped past the forward lines. By 0600, the writing was on the wall. Gabriel could not hold indefinitely. Marlowe ordered a fighting withdrawal towards the second line and Pill Bunker 3, a squat blockhouse of reinforced concrete that anchored the western approach to the battery.
Engineers, set charges in the communication trench. When we fall back, I want the saps gone.
Hale ordered.
No clear path for them.
The withdrawal began in bloody increments, 10 yards at a time, leapfrogging squads holding until the next could take their position. The hellish forces pressed hard, sensing the falter, but the faithful's discipline held just long enough for the survivors to reach the bunker line. Behind them, where the engineers lit the fuses, the eastern saps went up in a great fountain of mud and fire, swallowing the dead and sealing the path. The enemy had taken Gabriel, but the second line still stood for now. The fall of Trenchline Gabriel did not come as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, grinding bleed. Every yard of mud taken in screams and smoke. By the time the survivors stumbled into the secondary trench network, the eastern sky was a black bruise of smoke and witch. These lines had not been meant for the main fight. They were communication and support trenches, the veins and arteries that fed the fortress and its war machine. Now they were the new front. The air was thicker here, not with the acrid tang of gunpowder alone, but with the underlying stink of hell's corruption. It crept over the parapets in the mist, coiling into dugouts and gun pits, making the very earth taste of ash. The communication relay, a squat stone and steel blockhouse bristling with aerials and shielded cables, stood as the lifeline between Garrison HQ and the rest of Crusader Command. If the relay fell, orders, artillery fire plans, and reinforcement requests would vanish into static. Lieutenant Hale's shock troopers crouched in the shadow of Pillbox West 2. The dugout door rattled from the distant shell impacts. Outside, the war beasts came. A tide of black armoured killers, moving in silence save for the scrape of their claws on metal. They darted between shell craters, with inhuman agility, their helms twisted as though sniffing the air for prey.
Pick your targets.
Hale whispered.
Make every shot count. No second chances.
The first war beast vaulted the parapet, moving too fast for the eye to track. Hale's shotgun barked once, the blast slamming the creature against the trench wall in a spray of black ichor. Others followed, dropping into the trench in a blur of steel and claws. The fight turned vicious instantly. Shotguns roared, trench clubs rose and fell, knives punched into gaps in plate. Behind the melee, faithful engineers worked feverishly on the relay's access hatch. They bolted it shut with fresh plates, rewiring shattered lines and hammering in sealing prayers with every rivet. Bullets hissed overhead. A ricochet took one of the engineers through the shoulder, but he kept working, muttering scripture through clenched teeth. The enemy pressed harder, sensing the prize within reach. Hale's men fought like wolves in a corner, each kill buying seconds for the relay to remain in the fight. The garrison HQ, a half-buried fortress of reinforced stone, was shuddering under a sustained witch-fire bombardment. Each blast painted the inner walls with green, shadows writhing across the faces of the officers and runners inside. Captain Marlowe stood over the sandbagged command table, a map of Sector 4 spread before him, pins marking units that were now dead, missing, or presumed annihilated. The comms receiver crackled constantly. Distress calls, requests for ammunition, casualty reports. The noise was constant, nagging reminders that the defense was fracturing.
Battery crew reports heavy casualties,
An aide said, voice raised over another impact.
Easternmost emplacements gone. We're down 2 guns, sir.
Erlo's jaw clenched.
Tell them to hold those guns until the barrels glow. Without them, the fortress falls before sundown.
From the HQ's observation slit, the view was grim. Legionnaire shock troops hammering into the forward barricades, supported by twisting siege engines, dragged on chains by hulking beasts. The Faithful's heavy machine guns cut swaths through them, tracers stitching the smoke, but for every rank that fell, another emerged from the haze. The defenders fought from firing steps, rifles cracking in disciplined volleys, grenadiers lobbing blessed fragmentation charges into the densest masses, the blasts flaring white against the corruption. Yet the hellish banners crept closer, foot by blood-soaked foot. The eastern flank was the most desperate. St. Veric's Fist, the 3 artillery battery emplacements consecrated months earlier, now stood reduced to 2 functioning batteries, having already lost their westernmost embankment. Here, the enemy's intent was unmistakable. They meant to silence the guns entirely. Siege engines, the size of barns, lumbered forward, their iron plating scarred by hundreds of impacts. Green fire dripped from their mouths, burning wherever it touched. Mud, timber, and flesh. Battery Commander Major Irvin shouted himself hoarse above the chaos. The crews worked with grim determination, muscles aching from hours of loading under fire. Shrine Anchorite Sister Cassian moved between them, chanting blessings into each shell before it was rammed into the breach. Every shot tore into the advancing enemy, hurling chunks of armor and flesh into the air, but nothing seemed to slow down their pace. When the siege engines and their escort reached the second trench line, the battery's infantry guard stepped forward. The Crusader Guard, in black and gold plate, mechanized infantry with shields locked tight. They absorbed the first crashing impact like a cliff against a storm. Maces smashing down into warped skulls, spears punching into glowing maws, machine gun fire chewing up any hellish forces that approached them. The ground shook with the fury of the clash. Defenders held for now. By 0710, the hellish assault split into 3 clear thrusts. War beasts and wretched flooded the relay trenches, followed by legionnaires and anointed. In the centre, siege beasts and witchfire pressed hard against the battery's flank, followed by the main bulk of the forces. To the east, legionaries hammer HQ barricades. With their numerical superiority, the hellish forces were able to attack all 3 positions at once. Marlowe knew this, and his decision was brutal and immediate.
Send the last reserve, the Crusader Guard 2nd Company, to St. Varric's Fist. The HQ and relay must hold with what they've got. If the guns fall, so does everything else.
The reserve emerged from the fortress gates, its dark wave of steel, with shields raised high, advanced into the maelstrom of fire and screaming steel. As they moved forward, reinforcing the last of the 1st Company, Hale's shock troopers were fighting knee-deep in gore, fighting a retreat from pillbox to pillbox, down the studded trench line to the second entrance of the communication relay, where they would make their stand. The HQ's western barricade cracked open under the weight of a battering ram, fashioned from some unholy bone. And to the centre, the guards slammed into the siege beasts, the impact echoing across the entire sector. Everywhere at once, the fate of Sector 4 balanced on the edge of a bayonet. The siege of the fortress had not yet begun, but already the defenders were fighting as if it were the last stand. The pale morning light that once seeped through the battlefield haze had been entirely consumed. The sky above Sector 4 was now a bruised canopy of smoke and burning ash, pierced only by the intermittent flashes of gunfire or from the green flare of witchfire and artillery bombs. The air was thick enough to taste ash, cordite, the metallic tang of blood. For the faithful, there was no clear front line anymore. The fighting now bled into every trench, every alley of sandbag and timber. Men fought back to pack, their only guide the direction of the next muzzle flash or the shadow of something moving in the smoke. In the second trench lines, a few pockets held out, but most of it had fallen by now, with mechanized infantry holding the last of the embankments. At 0740, the centre line ruptured. The Crusader Guards' countercharge against the siege engines had slowed the tide, but the enemy's momentum and sheer strength in numbers returned with redoubled fury. Only 2 of their siege pieces remained, iron-bound abominations with heavy guns and hellfire flamethrowers. They made the earth quake. The first of the beasts smashed through a section of the forward wire like a hammer through glass, scattering mangled barbs into the mud. Its molten maw spewed arcs of green fire, the flames clinging to men and burning through armour as if it were parchment. A Crusader guard raised his shield in defiance. The fire rolled over it, and the man beneath fell, screaming as his plate glowed red. The second beast did not head for the front. It skirted the edge of the wire entirely, pounding towards the battery's central gun pit. Major Irvine, seeing the move, shouted for all reserve grenadiers to intercept. The grenades went off beneath its tracks, shearing away armour and splintering its engine. But the beast kept moving, driven by something unnatural. One gun crew fired point blank into its breastplate, the shell detonating inside the ribcage of the beast. The blast ripped it in 2, but the falling hunks of metal crushed 3 men beneath its weight. Its death gave no reprieve, as legionaries poured in the gap behind it, their shields interlocked and their weapons bristling. When the eastern emplacement was overrun, Irvine had no choice.
Scuttle the east guns.
He bellowed. Charges were set along the breach and recoil housing, and the detonation blew sanctified fragments across the killing ground, tearing through the front ranks of legionnaires. The cost was brutal, but it denied the enemy the weapons intact. Now St. Varric's fist was reduced to one working piece, the centrepiece and most fortified. Its crew was bloodied, exhausted, but still loading and firing, as if each round were a prayer. However, with the eastern trenches overrun, this left the communication relay on its own, isolated from the rest of the battle. And in the east, the communication relay stood like a stubborn tooth in the jaw of the fierce network. Scarred by shrapnel, its aerials bent but still clawing into the grey sky. Inside, the receiver room hummed weakly, ruin lamps flickering, as engineers rerouted damaged circuits. Lieutenant Hall's shock troopers held the outer trench, or what was left of it. More crater than trench, sandbags shredded, duckboard splintered. Every few seconds, a warbeast's head would rise over the parapet, only to be smashed back down by a shotgun blast, or a burst of carbine fire. However, the warbeasts were not alone this time. Legionnaire detachments advanced behind them, using the larger creatures as living shields. Blessed rounds cut down the front rank, but more always came, stepping over the fallen without hesitation. At 07:55, the first breach in the outer trench came from below, and not a wretched, burrowing through the mud, emerged inside the trench like rats from a hole. Hale's men cut them down in a blur of buckshot and bayonet, but the breach let more warbeasts slip through the killing zone. Hale knew the lion could not hold indefinitely. Still, he refused to order demolition.
We keep the relay up as long as there's breath in us,
he told his men. At the garrison HQ, the outer yard had become a blood-soaked battlefield. The legionnaires had breached the northern barricade, their anointed cutting a path with swings that sheared through timber, sandbag, and bone alike. Captain Marlowe directed the defence from the inner strongpoint's observation slit, barking orders to runners who vanished into the smoke-choked trenches. Mortar crews inside the HQ were firing their tubes horizontally now, the rounds exploding at ranges so close the shockwaves rattled the chapel's stained glass. The chapel bell tolled above it all, rung not for service, but for defiance. Each peal seemed to strengthen the faithful in the yard below. The legionnaires pressed hard, but every metre they took cost them triple in blood. By 08:05, the situation across the field was dire. The battery was one embankment away from silence. The relay was hanging on by a thread, and the HQ was half overrun. By 08:30, the outer trench of the communication relay was barely worthy of the name. The duckboards were splintered, the sandbags shredded, and the entire line was pitted with craters, where shells had landed so close, their heat still rose into the morning sky. Every shot fired was answered by two from the enemy, and the hiss of incoming rounds had become a near-constant background noise. Lieutenant Hall limped along the firing step, one boot squelching in mud that was more red than brown. Of his original company of shock troopers, only 7 remained in fighting condition. Helmets dented, uniforms scorched, some men carried weapons taken from the dead when theirs had broken or run dry. The hatch to the relay's inner room rattled with each impact from the battering ram. It was a crude thing, just a length of blackened steel, capped with a horned skull, but each blow was deliberate, patient, almost ritual. The men inside knew this wasn't a hurried assault. The enemy wanted the defenders to feel each heartbeat they had left. Inside, the engineers worked feverishly. Rune-inscribed copper coils glowed faintly as they rerouted power from damaged boards to keep the aerials alive for one more broadcast. One more desperate order, one more cry for aid that would never come. The whole room smelled of hot gunpowder, metal, and sweat. When the hatch finally gave way, it did so in a shower of splinters and dust. The first war beasts through were met with point-blank shotgun blasts that hurled it back into the legionnaires behind. The breach instantly became a knot of writhing bodies, shields pressed into doorframes, bayonets stabbing, boots kicking. Hale fought like a man already dead, reloading by touch, smashing a legionnaire's jaw with his shotgun butt before firing again into another's chest. The engineers, realizing there would be no escape, abandoned their tools and drew sidearms. The fighting spilled over the consoles, knocking over lamps and scattering loose papers like snow in the smoky air. One of the enemy blades caught Hal under the arm, sliding through plate and into his ribs. He dropped to one knee, teeth clenched, and rammed his bayonet up into the attacker's visor, twisting until the man went limp. When the last defensive lines inside the room buckled, Sergeant Thorne, blood running down his cheek, made the call. Now! Now! The charges, already wired into the relay support beams, detonated in a deafening roar. Stone, steel, and sanctified circuitry were torn apart in an instant. Aerials cartwheeled into the mud outside, some still sparking faintly as they fell. The blast incinerated everyone who was still inside, friend and foe alike. But the enemy had not captured the relay. It died on its own terms. With Lieutenant Hal and the communication relay gone, the faithful are on the brink of defeat. The garrison HQ is being surrounded, and the fortress guns are holding on by sheer faith alone. Though Lieutenant Hal's sacrifice had saved the communication relay from falling into enemy hands, it also meant the final bastion on the western flank had fallen. This meant Hell's forces had a nearly direct way to the fortress. Von Tessen and Marlowe both knew this had almost sentenced their death. But the battle was not over yet. Not while there was still faithful left to fight. Okay, so that was the video. I hope you have enjoyed. And part 2 will be coming out next Saturday. As I said at the beginning, this video is something completely different to my usual content. It's been something I've been wanting to do for a while. I've always liked making stories, and I have always thought the battles in Trench Crusade must be something incredible. So I tried to write that, and I hope that you enjoy. And once again, I want to give a big thank you to my friends for voicing the characters in this. They didn't have to. It was honestly a really fun time to record though. I have a blooper reel of that, but I don't know if that's ever going to be shown the light of day. It was great fun. And I actually, despite how long it's taken, I actually really enjoyed this style of animation. So if you would like to see more, of course, let me know. I'd love to make more. I probably will anyway. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next Saturday for part 2.